Welcome to Aviafly, the YouTube history channel with aircraft, airlines, and aviation podcasts. German and Portuguese language terms appear in this podcast. We can't pronounce these terms correctly, and it remains with an English pronunciation, which the listener may forgive us and hopefully can take with humor. Today's topic: VARIG. VARIG was an airline based in Brazil, in Porto Alegre and Rio de Janeiro. It was a highly ranked and respected airline primarily known for its short-haul flights within Brazil. VARIG was not only the largest airline in Brazil but also one of the largest private companies outside the United States. Whenever VARIG was mentioned in South America, it was usually about its extensive intercontinental services to Europe, North America, Africa, and Asia. These lines were the flagship of the company. Also of interest were the short-haul services VARIG operated, which were rarely found in this form in the US or Europe. The emphasis is on operate because the air bridge between Rio and São Paulo, Brazil's two largest cities, each with a population of more than 10 million, was a joint venture between the country's four primary lines. The emphasis is on operate because the air bridge between Rio and São Paulo, Brazil's two largest cities, each with a population of more than 10 million, was a joint venture between the country's four primary lines. Besides VARIG, these were the companies Trans-Brazil, Cruzeiro, and VASP. The aircraft, however, were provided exclusively by VARIG. The first Lockheed turboprop took off from Rio's airport at 6:30 in the morning, while at the same hour, a plane departed from São Paulo in the opposite direction. The next followed at half-hour intervals, every 15 minutes at peak times. The flight time was 45 minutes. The history. In the years following World War I, many former pilots of the German Reichsluftfahrt emigrated overseas and attempted to establish an aviation company. Their aircraft were Junkers F-13 planes or Dornier whale flying boats. Both were metal monoplanes and far better suited for unexplored countries than other aircraft of the 1920s. Untouched areas were still plentiful in South America at that time. One of the German immigrants was Otto Ernst Meyer from Hanover, who disembarked in Brazilian Recife in 1921. He intended to work in a textile company but wanted to establish an aviation company. At that time, Brazil needed airplanes. This country was almost 23 times larger than Germany, Switzerland, and Austria combined. So air transport was the magic word to turn the country into an industrial nation. In 1921, however, industrial companies hardly saw the possibilities of air transport. Otto Ernst Meyer and a few old comrades spent years trying to persuade the essential people in the German industry who did not want to hear about his ideas. It was not until 5 years later, and after two fruitless initiatives of his own, that Meyer received official approval to establish an airline. He founded the company VARIG, together with several German-Brazilian personalities. The German company Condor Syndicate, nowadays Lufthansa, held 21% of VARIG's shares. VARIG was granted tax exemption, which meant a substantial easing of takeoff. Otto Ernst Meyer immediately traveled to Germany and negotiated with the Condor Syndicate in Berlin to deliver a whale-type flying boat for demonstration purposes. A 200-horsepower Dornier whale with 9 seats was ferried to South America by Captain Rudolf von Clausbruck. The plane was renamed Atlantico and flew from Rio to Porto Alegre, where Meyer lived, in 2 days with a few stops. The company was not officially registered as an airline when the first 3 ticketed Brazilian passengers flew from Porto Alegre to Rio Grande on February 2. On May 7, 1927, on the recommendation of the Condor Syndicate, 2 airlines were founded. Sindicato Condor, later Cruzeiro, and VARIG, of which Meyer was appointed managing director. The great majority of technicians, pilots, and board members were German. VARIG obtained the Atlantico with the registration PBAAA. It was the first civil aircraft in Brazil. First problems. So VARIG had finally become a reality. But now, the problems began. The whale had apparently been fitted with inferior fuselage panels. In its first year of service, it was out of service for 200 days due to corrosion. To maintain scheduled service, VARIG had to buy a second aircraft and immediately fell into the red. With the purchase of a Dornier Merkur, which could carry 8 passengers, air traffic picked up again, but bankruptcy loomed constantly. The young employee Ruben Berta, a descendant of German and Hungarian grandparents and Meyer's first assistant in 1925, handled the office work in Porto Alegre. He was also responsible for advertising, maintenance tasks, and the airline's administration. From time to time, he also greeted passengers on the arrival of a Dornier whale and helped them carry their luggage. Berta's organizational skills and skillful financial dealings got the company through all the crisis periods between 1929 and 1931. Soon VARIG's scheduled service encompassed more and more cities in the south of the country. Like Condor, VARIG purchased only German aircraft until 1941, such as the Junkers F-13, G-24 seaplanes, and later Messerschmitt aircraft from Lufthansa and Junkers Ju-52. In December 1941, the war began to have an impact on Brazil as well. The government allied with the Allies from the start, and later joined the war on their side. Otto Ernst Meyer had to resign from his position, and he was succeeded by Berta. Despite the war, VARIG maintained its service and, in 1942, opened its first international route to Montevideo with a DEH, Rapide, and a 4-seat Fiat. Within the company, individual teams worked out new routes and worked closely with the government. Thus, runways were built in still unexplored jungle areas of Brazil. In 1944, Ruben Berta established the Foundation, an association of experienced professionals. This democratically structured group, with a chief executive officer chosen for a 5-year period, who could be ousted at any time by a majority vote, eventually took control of the company's management. The president of the group, Bertia, was also the managing director of VARIG, and he retained this position until he passed away in 1966. The boom in the post-war period. VARIG achieved its most remarkable breakthrough shortly after the end of the war. Berta went to Egypt to purchase 4 Douglas Dakota C-47s at a low cost. However, this trip was unnecessary because the war had left a glut of C-47s, the military version of the DC-3. Funding assistance from the U.S. enabled VARIG to purchase 34 C-47 aircraft and other DC-3 versions. Experienced unemployed pilots and ground crews were also more than plentiful, so nothing stood in the way of expansion. Previously, VARIG flights had been limited to a relatively small area in Rio Grande do Sul. The company was now expanding service northward, Rio, Sao Paulo, and all other major cities. The current capital, Brasilia, did not exist at the time. VARIG grew almost overnight from a small operation with a ragtag fleet of 5 small aircraft to one of the major aviation companies with 34 aircraft. Now, the amount each aircraft could hold was more than the total amount the entire fleet could hold before the war ended. The competition. During the 1950s, several other regional aviation companies operated alongside VARIG. VARIG bought some of them. But others had had the same idea, so at that time, there were 5 other airlines, each as big as VARIG. Rail quickly became the largest transportation company in Brazil, and VARIG could not touch this group. Ruben Berta was interested in the long-haul route to New York City, but Pan-Air do Brasil, Brazil's established flag carrier, was already flying that route. It also served foreign routes with the support of Pan Am. On February 29, 1952, VARIG bought Aero, a small airline with concessions to fly from Natal to Santos. With this purchase, VARIG greatly enlarged its operations in Brazil, extending services beyond Rio de Janeiro to Natal along the Brazilian coast. Around 3 years later, in July 1955, Bertia ventured to purchase new super constellations and opened a long-distance route from Buenos Aires south to New York via Rio. VARIG challenged his strong competitor Pan Air by offering better service and cuisine. Despite the many disadvantages, VARIG increased its share of air traffic and was able to operate its first jet aircraft, 2 Caravels, in 1959. VARIG was impressed by the Rolls-Royce Avon engines. As a result, it ordered Rolls-Royce Conway engines for its first Boeing 707s, which arrived in 1960. Expansion. The expansion was soon followed by the most profound change in Brazilian aviation. In 1961, the giant rail faced a financial crisis. A government order to the company to open a new, costly route to Los Angeles and Tokyo plunged Rail into bankruptcy. However, Rail was such a large company that it could not simply be allowed to go into liquidation. The Brazilian government, therefore, gave VARIG the order to take over Rail. Rubem Berta said that the takeover was like a mouse swallowing an elephant. VARIG faced a daunting task. Its fleet had grown threefold overnight, with the state-of-the-art CV998 Coronado jets, Electra 2 turboprops, and several DC-3 and Curtiss C-46 aircraft from Real's hangars. 4 years later came the next shock to Brazil's aviation. Pan-Air do Brasil, the country's leading airline, faced severe financial problems. On February 9, 1965, it finally filed for bankruptcy. Again, the Brazilian president asked Rubem Berta to take over the company. A few hours later, the first scheduled VARIG flight to Europe took place with a Pan-Air 707. VARIG officially took over the Brazilian overseas network and Pan-Air's personnel and equipment in the following days. Within 10 years, VARIG had grown from a small regional airline with barely 1,000 employees to the largest airline in Latin America with over 15,000 employees. This quite astonishing expansion had proceeded relatively smoothly and without sensation. In 1974, VARIG took delivery of the first of 4 Douglas DC-10s ordered 2 years earlier to replace the Boeing 707. It was the first wide-body aircraft used by a Latin American airline. Because of their long range and speed, they were used on the company's long-haul routes, such as New York, Frankfurt, Paris, Rome, and London, and also on flights to Tokyo with a stopover in Los Angeles. Throughout its history, the company operated 15 DC-10s. Also, in the 1970s, the company deployed its first Boeing 727s, which were used on domestic and international routes to Latin America, Miami, and Cape Verde. At the end of their useful life, some were converted into freighters and passed on to VARIG Log. Given VASP's success with its Boeing 737s, VARIG purchased 10 models between 1974 and 1975, which became one of its main aircraft, replacing most of its turboprops on domestic routes. In May 1975, VARIG took control of the Sindicato Condor company, the Cruzeiro do Sul. It continued to fly under the old name, but VARIG eliminated double-served routes and maintenance facilities. At the time of the takeover, the Cruzeiro fleet consisted of Boeing 727 and Boeing 737 aircraft, also used for most VARIG domestic flights. In 1980, 2 Airbus A300B-4203 were also used on many routes. What set VARIG apart from its more established rivals like Lufthansa, Air France, KLM, and Pan American was the high level of quality in its in-flight service. First-class passengers were given caviar, and dinner was cooked on a spit on some flights. In 1981, VARIG took delivery of its first Boeing 747-200. Brazilian President João Baptista Figueiredo was on the inaugural flight from Brasilia to Campo Grande. 3 jets operated initially on routes to New York City, Frankfurt, Paris, London, and Rome. VARIG's growth and the addition of foreign companies caused the airport Galeão to become congested. This was Brazil's main international airport from which almost all international flights departed. This situation forced the government to build an airport in Guarulhos. It was located in the São Paulo metropolitan area and the country's economic center. However, it only had the Congonhas Airport, which had only small capacities for long-haul flights. São Paulo International Airport was inaugurated in January 1985 with a VARIG Boeing 747-200 from New York. Subsequently, many Brazilian and foreign companies relocated part of their operations to the new airport. International flights originating and terminating in Rio stopped in Sao Paulo before continuing to their final destination, with a greater flow of passengers. That same year, VARIG expanded its Boeing 747 fleet with two 300 version aircraft, which had greater range and capacity. These aircraft replaced the Boeing 707 and were used on routes to Paris, New York, Frankfurt, London, Johannesburg, and Tokyo. As for maintenance of VARIG aircraft, the company had one of the largest maintenance yards in South America at Rio International Airport, which opened in 1979. 1986, two Boeing 767-200s were ordered as part of plans to expand domestic service. The twin-engine aircraft could operate intercontinental flights more efficiently than four-engine aircraft. They were VARIG's first aircraft that did not require a flight engineer on board. In 1987, six 200ER version aircraft were added, with a more extended range. They served on routes to South America, North America, and Europe, on charter and scheduled flights between Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, and in the country's northeast, in cities such as Salvador and Fortaleza. In 1987, VARIG received its first Boeing 737-300, initiating a new fleet modernization. The replacement of the Boeing 737-200 ended in 2003. From 1990, VARIG took delivery of a further 9 300ER aircraft, which were used on routes to Lisbon, Madrid, Rome, Milan, Chicago, Atlanta, and Toronto. The main international destinations of the VARIG service were North and Central America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. The only planned service that has not yet been realized was a round-the-world trip, and Australia was not included in the route network. Star among all VARIG routes was the air bridge between Rio and Sao Paulo, which had a seat load factor of almost 85%, a figure many other airline managers could only dream of. The 1980s were marked by a modernization of the fleet, growth in the number of destinations, and increasing financial problems in high inflation and a foreign currency crisis. Furthermore, with the end of the military regime and the return to democracy in 1985, VARIG lost its intimate connection with the ruling powers. In 1990, with gradual deregulation promoted by the federal government, VASP and Transbrasil were authorized to fly to international destinations, breaking an almost monopoly held by VARIG since 1965. Cruzeiro do Sul was the only exception. More international carriers were also allowed to fly to Brazil, significantly increasing competition. Slowly, VARIG began to lose its financial health, aggravated by the early 1990s world recession and administration problems. In 1988, VARIG moved its operational hub from Rio de Janeiro to Sao Paulo. In 1991, VARIG received its first leased Boeing 747-400, with two more orders delivered in 1992 and 1993. This version took over routes to New York, Paris, and Rome and opened the route from Rio de Janeiro to Hong Kong with stops in Sao Paulo, Johannesburg, and Bangkok. However, they remained with the company until 1994, when they were returned. The company was also looking for an aircraft to replace the McDonnell Douglas DC-10s, which were already experiencing maintenance problems. During the same period, the manufacturer launched the MD-11, which featured new technology, a digital cabin, greater range, and higher passenger and cargo capacity. VARIG acquired the type to use it for highly profitable flights. The first two aircraft were delivered in late 1991 and were intended for flights from Sao Paulo to Frankfurt and Paris. 1998, VARIG expanded its MD-11s to routes to Amsterdam, Bangkok, Buenos Aires, Hong Kong, Johannesburg, London, Milan, New York, and Rome. 5 years later, the company started an air freight company under the name VARIG Cargo. Eventually, VARIG bought 49% of the shares of Pluna Uruguayan Airlines. This company was founded in September 1936 and began operations on November 19, 1936. In an attempt to solve the increasing problems of VARIG, Carlos Willie Engels became president in 1995, and in 1996 he was succeeded by Fernando Pinto. The latter would be the last president of the consolidation phase in the company's history. He developed an ambitious project to bring back financial and operational health to the company. This project's two most visible milestones were the new corporate image launched on October 15, 1996, the first change since 1955, and VARIG OnStar Alliance membership as of October 22, 1997. VARIG was its sixth member airline and the first to join after it was launched only 5 months earlier. During the 1998 Farnborough Airshow, VARIG announced its most significant aircraft purchase. It involved 39 aircraft, divided into 15 Boeing 737-700s and 10 Boeing 737-800s. Furthermore, 6 Boeing 767-300ERs and 8 Boeing 777-200ERs were ordered. Despite some success in reorganizing the company, President Fernando Pinto did not have the full support of Ruben Berta Foundation, the controller of VARIG, and, as a consequence, he left the presidency of VARIG in January 28, 2000. That same year he became the CEO of TAP Portugal and successfully reorganized that airline. Osier Silva, former president of the Brazilian aircraft manufacturer Embraer, succeeded Pinto. The administration of Osier Silva, which lasted for only 2.5 years, started with significant restructuring in the company, aiming at making Ruben Berta Foundation more powerful and the president weaker. Also, on January 28, 2000, all cargo operations were united under a new airline named VARIG. Despite the reforms, VARIG posted a deficit for the first time in its history. VARIG was an independent company within the VARIG Group. It started its operations with more than 1,000 employees and a fleet consisting of 4 B727-100F cargo aircraft, 4 B727-200F, and 3 DC-1030F. The company had a worldwide network of sales and distribution centers with hubs in Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Manaus, Porto Alegre, Frankfurt, Miami, and New York. In 2005, the company received its first MD-11F, the first cargo model of its kind in South America. In 2000, VARIG acquired some Boeing 737-400s, which were used by Trans-Brazil. In October 2001, VARIG took delivery of its first Boeing 777-200ER, a more technologically advanced aircraft with a customized entertainment system that allows passengers to choose what they want to see on a screen at their seat. In 2005, VARIG received 2 more Boeing 777-200s from United Airlines and British Airways. The new aircraft were used on routes to Miami, New York, Frankfurt, Madrid, Paris, Amsterdam, and London, alternating with MD-11s. However, in 2001, after the September 11 attacks, commercial aviation entered a crisis that led to global considerations. At the same time, 2 major competitors of VARIG were created and expanded, LATAM Airlines Brazil and Gol Linhas Aéreas. In 2002, Ruben Berta Foundation merged the administration of VARIG and its subsidiary, Rio Sul Serviços Aéreos Regionais, which included the brand Nordeste Linhas Aéreas Regionais. The 3 brands were used separately, with Rio Sul and Nordeste providing feeder services to VARIG. Year-long discussions to merge VARIG with TAM Airlines ended unsuccessfully in 2004, and the same year VARIG fell to 3rd place in the Brazilian domestic market share, behind TAM and Gol. VARIG applied to the Commercial Bankruptcy and Reorganization Court in Rio de Janeiro on June 17, 2005, for the commencement of judicial reorganization proceedings according to the new bankruptcy and restructuring law of Brazil. The request was granted on June 22, 2005. VARIG continued to provide services despite its financial troubles. To raise funds, the Bankruptcy and Reorganization Court decided to sell 2 of VARIG's subsidiaries. In November 2005, the maintenance center VM Maintenance and Engineering was sold to a consortium presided by the Portuguese airline TAP Portugal. In December 2005, the cargo division VARIG was sold to Volo do Brasil, a consortium started by the private equity fund Matlin Patterson Global Advisors and 3 Brazilian investors. The negotiation was concluded in June 2006. After 2 unsuccessful attempts to auction the airline as a whole, the bankruptcy court decided to split the airline into 2 different judicial entities, informally known as Old VARIG and New VARIG. The first portion was formerly called Nordeste Linhas Aéreas S.A. It was informally known as Old VARIG and comprised the brand Nordeste, 1 aircraft, debts, liabilities, legal disputes, various assets, concessions, and properties of the original VARIG. Since Old VARIG could not use the name VARIG anymore, the company used the brand name Nordeste for a while, and in 2008, it began using the name Flex Linhas Aéreas. The second portion, called VRG Linhas Aéreas and informally known as New VARIG, was a brand new airline. It included the VARIG and RioSul brands, VARIG's route rights, all but 1 aircraft, and the Smiles Miles program. On July 14, 2006, New VARIG was put up for sale by auction. Volo do Brasil, the owner of VARIG Log, won the auction. The legal process was completed on July 20, 2006. 1 day later, the New VARIG cancelled all its flights, except for the Rio de Janeiro-São Paulo shuttle service, which remained in operation through an agreement with Old VARIG. 7 days later, New VARIG announced that it would cut 60% of its staff. Between September and November 2006, New VARIG announced its intentions to gradually resume some international and domestic flights. On December 14, 2006, the National Civil Aviation Agency of Brazil issued the final certificate to the New VARIG, making it fully operational. Soon after the certificate was granted, orders for 16 aircraft were announced to bring the fleet to 31 aircraft, and the operating agreement with Old VARIG expired. On August 18, 2009, the National Civil Aviation Agency of Brazil renewed Flex's authorization to operate non-regular passenger, cargo, and postal services. Consequently, Flex has been operating flights on behalf of other airlines as part of contracted arrangements. Between June 2005 and September 2009, Old VARIG remained in recovery order in the First Business Court of Rio de Janeiro. After the bankruptcy protection was lifted, the administration of the airline could have returned to its original owner, the Fundação Rubem Berta, which still owned 87% of the shares of VARIG. However, the foundation preferred to keep a judicial administrator. On January 31, 2007, VARIG Brazilian Airlines, the Old VARIG, was suspended from membership in Star Alliance for not fulfilling membership prerequisites. On March 28, 2007, Gol Airlines purchased New VARIG for $320 million and announced that VRG, the operator of the brand VARIG, would continue to operate under its original name. The transaction was completed in following April. The new owner radically restructured the fleet. The network eliminated the first-class cabin from the aircraft and gradually transformed the brand VARIG into the arm of Gol Group, specializing in international scheduled and charter medium and long-haul destinations. On October 23, 2007, VARIG's new corporate image was unveiled, stressing the orange color of Gol. In September 2008, Gol was merged into VRG. It became an airline with 2 different brands, VARIG and Gol. Consequently, in mid-April 2009, VARIG's booking systems were integrated into Gol's. The Smiles Frequent Flyer program was reformulated to include Gol. Around 9 months later, New VARIG ceased to operate its own flights and started to use Gol's flight numbers. From 2006 to 2009, New VARIG was obliged by contract to purchase a minimum of 140 hours per month of services from Old VARIG. Therefore, some VRG flights operated with Gol flight numbers were flown with chartered aircraft from Flex. Due to accumulated debts, Flex was declared bankrupt by the First Business Court of Rio de Janeiro in August 2010. The liquidation proceedings were initiated. The Rubem Berta Foundation requested that the bankruptcy proceedings be suspended in September. Flex was then able to return in practice to its recovery order status. The airline ceased operations in February 2012. This was the Aviafly podcast. We would be pleased about your like and your subscription because this is the only way we can continue to offer you exciting podcasts from the world of aviation.